The new mask units are a really exciting new mechanic coming out of D-BT10 and feels very reminiscent of the reverse phenomenon and reverse units from the OG era Link Joker series, as well as most recently seen kind of reinvented in the V era. But I'm an OG fan, so this got me really excited for the reverse when it first came out. But most notably, I think Masques is way more significant of a mechanic than Reverse was for multiple reasons. So as you can see on your screen, I've got a list for Astrea Biko Mask that I'll be showing off today, as well as providing some gameplay uploaded either later today or tomorrow. Haven't decided yet at the time of recording this, but you'll notice that this list, just real quick, there are some Festival Collection cards. We won't have Festival Collection English till July, while we will have the D-BT10 cards the second Friday of June. So I will be providing, after I go over this list, some alternatives that you can run in place of these Festival Collection cards before it comes out. But that being said though, why is Masques more significant mechanically than the reverse was? Well, for those of you who weren't around for the reverse era or don't know what those units are, don't worry about it, because that's not relevant for this video. But the reason why Masque is mechanically significant is because Mask decks will always get Persona Ride first if they do have their masks and the Masks unit in hand. Well, Mask being the mask of Hydro Gum here, which is really strong. It just means that going first or second, you're still being your opponent to Persona Ride, which is really strong. Really just means you don't mind too much. I still think going first with most of these is correct, because the grade 3s do provide, before you go into Mask, do provide some really good skills, and they're just stronger than the grade 2s. So I think you'd rather get to your grade 3 doing Trin Drive a bit stronger first, and it still get your Persona Ride second anyway. For the ride line, I do run the standard Almajestar ride line. It's just the best one that the deck has. It does the most for it, even though I don't think it actually really supports Unica as well as other ride lines support their main grade 3, because Unica, you really want all three of these skills here have 3 critical triggers bound for it to really feel worth it and really strong. But Short Sparta and Turn Dyna, they don't actually search your critical triggers. They just help you be able to build a board and set up Soul to, well, really it's the Soul Charge 2, just replace the 2 of them, and maybe getting a draw if you Soul Charge a critical trigger. So you have chances to find it, but really it's just setting up your board. Turn Dyna just lets you make sure you can get triggers from drop to soul to be able to proc the Astrea Unica skill. So it does help you utilize triggers that you've already used to guard to get them back to soul, or maybe discard for ride line, which is nice, but again, they just don't actually find you the critical triggers. And while Biko Mask certainly is a very powerful upgrade to Unica, not really caring if it Soul Blast critical triggers or not, like it does matter to power up itself in the unit you stand, but you get the stand regardless. So again, the critical triggers don't actually matter for this, which does make it a nice upgrade because it doesn't have that kind of pitfall that the original Unica had. But at the same time, I do think the original Unica is still strong enough to sit on if you're going first, even if you don't necessarily get all the critical triggers. As long as you've got triggers in Soul, you're still giving stuff 5k, you're still getting your Twin Drive, and I think it's just more powerful to wait to get off the Persona Ride with Mask of Hydrodrum in the following turn, especially if you still have only 1 Biko Masks in hand. So definitely a card still worth going into for the reasons I outlined. So as I said, I do think Biko Mask is a nice upgrade to the Unica. The only thing it feels like it's lacking is just that crit pressure. If it had an extra crit on it, that would be great. But I do kind of focus this deck around not trying to turbo get those critical triggers into Soul, since they really just help scale your front row. But if I'm Persona Running, I'm not too worried about it. It would be very nice if I could, but this deck only runs 8 critical triggers. It only can run 8 critical triggers. So I do think it's better just to kind of focus on this game plan of get into Biko Mask. And if you find the crits, you find the crits. Awesome. If you don't, you don't. But in the main deck, I want to first go over sort of the Mask core, since this is the main strategy of the deck to get into Biko Mask to do restand and retire stuff, extra drive, all that good stuff. So for Biko Masks, this should be pretty obvious, since we need to ride into it, so we want to max out to make sure we find it, and also to be able to Persona Ride in subsequent turns. So 4 copies just maximize our chances of finding it. Super important. We can also just ride into this if we never find Mask. It's not optimal, but at least we really want to only spend no more than 1 turn on Unicus and just get to that Biko Mask, get that restand. So at least we have that option, which is worth noting. But as for the Mask, we do run 2 of it, just because it is pretty much hard locked into just searching out a card and then being able to facilitate going into our Masks, our Masks unit. And we do have a searcher here for Skull Chemda, and I do think, I was actually a bit surprised. I thought this would be a bit clunky in the deck because it is a bit costly, but I think it does this job very well. Being able to get a Dragon Tree marker is also quite nice, and we don't always need to use it. It's also extra cards to find off of Mask of Hydro Gum, so we're less likely to whiff it and go -1 by using it, instead just filtering into a card, obviously. And I do think that a 4-2 ratio makes a lot of sense because this deck does struggle to plus. It does have some plussing, but it's really subject to variance, and just with all the other cards I run in here, Masques is just hard locked into that one use case, at least in hand. And since PGs are the only cards that are really discarding in this, I would rather have more Skull Chemda and have to use its skill, but at least have it as a 5k shield or a unit on board than just breaking out extra masks. Hence the ratios here, and it's worked out great for me so far. You might find through testing that maybe you cut down to 3 Skull Chemda, or maybe you want to see it more consistently, so you bump it up to 3 Mask of Hydro Gum. That's perfectly valid and definitely worth tinkering around for. I highly recommend doing that, but this is the ratio that I found worked best for me. I also run 2 of the regular Unica just to make sure I can find one extra one, because usually this deck's most lacking part is survivability. I'll tell you that up front. So I only really feel like I need to find the 1 extra Unica, because most of the time after that, I'm losing, or if I even survive to my next turn, I don't think this card, like being able to consistently get it, would really matter. Most of the time, I think it'd just be a dead card in hand shield value wise off of a drive check. Can be called down to board, but again, just through testing, I found 2 just felt nice to be able to see it consistently enough to be able to enable my Biko Masks skill, which is a good one, and definitely want to use the extra drive is crucial. So pretty much 2 copies felt like just enough to be able to see it to use that skill, which I want to, but not enough where I was just having cards without shield value in hand. The other nice thing is if I'm really struggling to find my masks, at least I still have access to a Persona Ride copy, though I'll admit most of the time I just play to get into the mask, so I'm either discarding it for Ride deck, for other like PGs, just any way to kind of get it into drop zone, since that's the best place to remove from with Biko Mask skill for just maximum effectiveness, because it pretty much means that drive 1's a +1. I should say that drive 1's a +1 for free, more or less. But I've kind of alluded to that this deck doesn't plus the most, or at least the most consistently. It's very subject to variance. So one of the best ways to plus in this deck I found is the Lemina here. Its ability when you discard for Ryland just to draw an extra card is huge. It helps find the pieces, helps assemble a board early on, find your mask and just Biko Mask or Skull Chemda, whatever you need to be able to facilitate that game plan, which is phenomenal. Pretty much when I see it in hand, I automatically discard it because I want that plus, and thankfully because Schwartz Sparta does Soul Charge 2, this card's live at pretty much every single turn, and I don't ever have 2 Soul Blast, a Turn Dyna, or the Schwartz Sparta, thankfully, to be able to use its skill. This card's also useful since we're aiming to go mask into Biko Masks. That means Persona Ride's often active, and since we run 4 copies of this, it's honestly a lot of times active even the turn after that, meaning that Lemina's second skill is live to be able to call it a rear guard. Again, just some plussing to build a board that's especially useful if I'm against a control or really a deck with board control options. And it doesn't even take away from souls, since it does replace itself with the Soul Charge 1. So overall, I think this is just a nice tool to make sure that I can always have a board and some extra plussing in the early game. The extra plussing in the early game is really the main reason why I run it, and the additional skill is definitely a nice bonus, as long as I have the counterblast, because this deck is very counterblast heavy. Do be prepared for that. But as for the more offensive core of the deck, here's the first card that is not going to be out with set 10. It's going to be out in July with Festival Booster, or Festival, is it called Festival Collection again? I actually don't remember, but pretty much the Festival Booster. It's the Crucial Dragon here. Every nation is getting a card similar to this one. Just being able to gain 10k power if your opponent checks a trigger means that it still attacks nicely even against triggers, and 10k shield in the event that my opponent drive checks a trigger. It just lets me have another 10k shield in hand, which isn't too bad. Unfortunately, it can't intercept. That'd be the thing that would make it better, but at least in hand, it's not necessarily a dead card. But it's still situational, but at least there's a chance for it not to be a dead card. The big reason why I run it is more for its offensive prowess. Being able to put a rear guard into Soul to give it retire 1 and give it 5k just kind of gives it more board presence. Being able to retire more, chip more away out my opponent's resources is very nice in a deck like this that does not have the best survivability. And the remove over trigger skill is also really strong. Preventing the opponent from calling grade 1 or greater cards from hand to Guardian Circle can be devastating. Late game, or even just being able to stack a ton of triggers onto this thing, possibly critical triggers. I really like this skill, and I think this is a really powerful offensive card. Only 3 copies because deck space is tight, and frankly, I only feel like I need to see 3 copies of this card since it's not a consistent 10k shield. not the most necessary, and because Turn Dyna calls itself out, really only calling one on the turn that I ride up into Astro Unica if I do have it, and sometimes we also want to call a Skull Chemda down just to search out the mask, so it's not always live, so therefore I felt 3 copies is good enough, and I see it plenty. Again, I'll get into what you can replace this card with for set 10 after I go over the rest of the deck profile. Final note about this card that you'll see if you watch the gameplay is that if you restand with Unica skill, you can actually boost with your rear guard, or your back row rear guard, your booster pretty much, with this card on the first swing, and then when it attacks a second time, you can put it into soul, because it does not say the rear guard in the same color as unit needs to be in stand, it can be in rest, which synergizes really well. You get just value out of the booster both times you swing. That's really strong as well. Moving over to the grade 1s, I do run 4 Zargon, as this is our best way to maintain our soul, and because I'm not really focusing too much on trying to get critical triggers into my soul, Zargon's nice as it lets me use my critical triggers either for discard for ride deck or for the just shield value in itself in the early game, and then I can try to pressure with Zargon to get that back either behind Vanguard in the early game where my opponent might not want to guard, or in the column that I'm restanding with, because since it gives the boosted unit that skill until the end of turn, even when it restands, it still has that ability. So a lot of the times what I'll want to do is I'll put this behind the unit that is I'm planning on restanding with my Biko Masques, gets that skill, so I have one swing with it pressuring, I swing with Biko Mask, restand it, I put all the triggers I get onto the other column, the one without the skill from Zargon, so that one has the pressure, and then this other rearguard column, they might be more inclined to take it because it doesn't have that crit pressure on it, and I still get to refund this, or not refund, but I get back this cards in soul to be able to make sure I can always use that Soul Blast 3 for Biko Mask. So all in all, this card's phenomenal for maintaining the soul and just kind of letting me still use my critical triggers for shield value, or really just even looping back cards to call it with Lamina. This card is just a phenomenal soul charge option in a deck that can fully utilize its skill to its, well, frankly, to its fullest. It's a bit redundant, but you get the idea. I also run 2 Twin Marvel Dragon, only 2 copies of this card because this is more of like an icing on top kind of card than necessarily facilitating the game plan and what needs to happen. Pretty much it works whenever your opponent's Soul Blast, so you get to check the top card of your deck, leave it on top, or put it to soul. This helps us dig deeper for triggers, and triggers is, well, you want to check triggers to try to end the game sooner in a deck that doesn't have the best survivability and just wants to end the game as soon as possible. I think what's also kind of become clear is with all the counterblast skills and no counter charge, which there is none in this deck, that the other part of just sustaining with this deck is you just will run out of counterblast. So more reason to run a card like this that just helps us check triggers to try to swing the game in our favor for a win sooner. And also the plus 2k making a 10k booster is great behind Vanguard, but we don't necessarily need to have it behind Vanguard, as sometimes we will have a Zargon behind there. It just synergizes generally good behind any grade 3, and we've got the Crucial Dragon, and sometimes we might even call out the Unicas, so just to make better numbers overall. Moving on to the defensive options, do run 4 PGs, one of them being the Elementary Sanctitude. This should be pretty self-explanatory for this kind of deck as of now, but a new defensive option is the new Regalis piece coming out of Festival Booster, Evergreen Transfer. Just a 25k shield with some over trigger hate. I like this card just for a little extra survivability. It doesn't come up too often, but it is nice when it is. But of course, you can switch this out for whatever card you need if you don't really want to run a card that has no offensive purpose to it. You can even run one of the other Regalis pieces. There's one that might help you find your Crucial Dragons, can even recall them from Drop Zone if you want that for your late game. I think that's a perfectly fine option since you really won't be using your mask that late in the game, but I kind of like the extra defensive option, and that way it doesn't necessarily clash with Mask of Hydreigon if I have them both in my hand and want to use both. So I do think this one definitely needs more testing, but that definitely needs a lot more testing because it's a one of, it doesn't show up as often. And honestly, you don't even need to run a Regalis piece. You can always just run maybe your 4th Crucial Dragon, 3rd Twin Marvel Dragon, 4th Unica, so 3rd one for the main deck, whatever you want. Again, this is the preference I want to test for my list. And with the games I played, frankly, since, as I kind of mentioned, since it's a one of, don't really have a conclusion on this one, just needs more testing. So honestly, let me know what you might want to test in this slot. Then wrapping up the list, we do have the triggers: 8 crit, 3 draw, 4 heal, 1 over trigger. So getting it right out of the way, Stem Deviate Dragon, this is another card that theoretically is nice because you can throw it down and put to soul to get an extra soul if you need. Just missing one for Biko Mask is another critical trigger to bind to get the power. Possibly, honestly, I was thinking with Unica, but frankly, you always want to swing with Unica first, at least in most cases. so Stem Deviate Dragon doesn't synergize the best with that. But at the same time, most of the time, what would happen is I would have the cards to build a board the way I wanted to, and then I would just lose before I get to my next turn anyway, that I might need to call down a Stem Deviate Dragon. So this is another one I'm not 100% sure on whether I want to keep the Stem Deviate Dragon to be able to get a crit to Soul, or just Assault in general, or would I prefer just to have a 5k card to call down to pair better with my grade 3s. But also, since I do run a lot of grade 2s to kind of fill it out, it's not the worst, but also there are some grade 0s that, not grade 0s, grade 1s that synergize better with the 5k shield. So this would just need more testing, and I think would also come down to just personal preference for how you play the deck. Also, I think what matters is, are you more focused on getting those not the grade 3s, but the critical triggers to bind zone, or are you just more concerned with the better numbers, and if you can get those cards to bind zone, awesome. I think that'll also influence your decision, and I definitely played this deck more towards just if I find them, awesome, and I get them. So arguably I should be running the 5k in that case, but it was kind of neither here nor there in the game. So more testing. Another one, you can let me know, would you prefer to run this one or the 5k crit triggers? 3 draw, as I said, this deck does not plus the best, or really the most consistently, so draw triggers make a lot of sense for this build. And the 4 heal triggers, you can obviously change these out for the effect heals depending on your meta. Since I'm just logging to CFA, I just want something generically good. And finally, the over trigger here, the Valnot. I do think this one is really good for the deck just to be able to swing in extra time. That's potentially an extra proc off of Zargon, and if we can check critical triggers, we get to then swing with them. And early in the game, it also lets us just draw a card and call one down to attack with as well. So overall, I do think this is much better than the Dark States over trigger. You can make an argument for the other one. What is it called? Make an argument for the Itzfaro because it does add a card back from your drop zone, helping with survivability an extra turn while also getting a crit on something, which actually honestly is not too bad to close out the game here. So the more I think about this one, I kind of been turning my nose down a bit at this, but at the same time, like, it's definitely not a bad card. I think the big question is with testing, does getting that extra card help your deck survive an extra turn consistently enough to make it worth it? And since this over trigger, it's only a 1-of per deck, kind of like the Regalis piece, it's kind of hard to kind of make that judgment call. So I definitely think this is a valid one to test with as well. I've just been using the Valnot for now because it definitely is a bit more swingy, and I've kind of been focusing my deck around being super swingy and closing out the game as soon as possible. But that's the deck list for when Festival Booster comes out. But what should the deck list look like, or what is my recommendation for the set list for set 10 before we get these cards? Well, frankly, you just cut obviously the Crucial Dragon and the Evergreen Transfer. You don't really have the best replacements for it, but specifically for these 4 slots, I think the best card is actually Kit's Peak Griffin. Kit's Peak Griffin plays a bit more into getting those critical triggers to bind zone, not by finding them, but being able to more easily loop them back, because in this build, once the turn Dyna goes away, there's no real consistent way to get the critical triggers from drop zone to soul, except with Zargon. But the later the game goes, the less likely it's going to hit because your opponent's going to go to higher damage. So it's not the most consistent, hence why I'm not really focusing on it. But Kit's Peak Griffin kind of bypass that just on place. You can put them both into soul. So really nice in the late game just to get possibly an extra 2 to be able to power up the front row, or really Biko Mask and the unit you restood by an extra 5k. So not too bad there. And it is shield value wise the same as Crucial Dragon, but more readily available, so that's also not too bad. And power wise, it just kind of lacks a bit more in that power if your opponent checks a defensive trigger that Crucial Dragon does. So it's definitely a fine replacement, kind of. It's just not the same. It's a bit different, but I do think it's totally worth playing. It's a good card. I just, when making space for testing out the Crucial Dragon, because I do think this is still the better offensive card with the board control, as well as the remove over trigger and the power scaling. So it lost out on that kind of edge to it, but again, I just thought the offensive pressure for this card was a bit better and warranted being replaced. And as for the Evergreen Transfer, it felt a bit awkward to run one Kit's Peak Griffin, so I decided to just try out the Regalis pieces. But yeah, that is my first recommendation for those 4 cards. But as for the Overtrigger, I think the Dark States Overtrigger is just better. It's an extra critical, it's a pseudo critical trigger onto your Vanguard that will last as long as the game goes. So it's just another, if you can check it early in like high roll, it's just going to carry you throughout the game, which the deck very much likes. But I do think that in the late game, it's not as impactful when your opponent's probably guarding your Vanguard more because it is on a triple drive. So I do think the Valknot is just better in that scenario. So again, I do think Valknot or even the other one is a bit more worth it than the Dark States OT, but the Dark States OT is more worth it than the Olbaria because of that extra crit pressure. Down in the description, I'll have a deck log linked, one for the D-BT10 specific list, and then one for the Festival Collection list as well, so you can see both for whatever format you're currently in at the time of watching this. So yeah, the main idea of this deck is just be able to get into Biko Masques, either going your second grade 3 turn going first or the first grade 3 turn going second, just so you can start restanding, gaining power, not be as limited in what you can do based on your critical triggers. And as you find critical triggers, the best of your ability, just kind of get them into Soul and bind them to pop your front row, but it's really not a main focus. I don't go out of my way to protect the turn and Dyna, because the important part is just the restand and to pressure, and just use powerful cards such as the Crucial Dragon to be able to put on pressure, Twin Marvel to be able to filter through triggers, and then Zargon to make sure I can sustain on Soul and just try to end the game as soon as possible. And without spoiling any of the gameplay, I do think Biko Masques is a nice upgrade to this deck to make it just feel more consistent, more like a coherent, actualized strategy. Still not fully there, but it definitely is a very nice card to play. And honestly, I had a lot of fun playing this deck, so I'll have the gameplay up either later today or tomorrow. I don't know what I'm going to do yet at the time of this recording, but once it is up, it'll be linked up in the card above and down in the description below, or just on my channel. And if it isn't up yet, please consider subscribing and turn on the notification bell so you're notified when I upload more content, so you'll know when that video goes up. But with that being said though, look forward to that gameplay video coming up, as well as more content on these brand new mask cards coming out real soon.